Richard Schwartz from Global Custodian, where I act as Head of Research and Special Projects. And I'm here with Kelly, Stephen, and Jesus, who are going to explain, first of all, they're going to give their surnames, but they're going to explain why they're here joining me. The broad subject we're talking about is the security services transaction chain, and we've chosen to focus on sub-custodians for perspective, but we're going to be looking more broadly at the entire chain and whether in fact it still is a chain, which is something we'll come on to later. But if you could introduce yourself, perhaps we'll start with Kelly.
Certainly. Good morning. Kelly Matheson. I lead the client experience team at Digital Asset.
And are an ex-global custodian, if I'm right.
I am, yes, I spent 3 decades in the security services space before coming to Digital Asset, so it is an industry near and dear to my heart.
And Stephen?
Stephen Hondeling. I work for Deutsche Bank and I'm responsible for security services operations globally. And I'm also running the business for the EMEA region for that same product.
And Jesus?
I'm Jesus Benito. I'm SIX Group Head of Domestic Custody and Trade Repository Operations. I'm also the CEO of Everclear.
Great. So let's go straight to it. And I think we'll start with Stephen, because as a sub-custodian, can you tell us something about the waters that sub-custodians are swimming in now? How's the temperature? How many people are swimming? What trends are you seeing? And also, does it vary from region to region? Because you're all around the world.
So I definitely think that the water has probably cooled down, depending how you want to define your analogy. But I think there's been a massive cost pressure in the last couple of years. And obviously there's a tendency for that cost pressure to be pushed down the chain. So expectations and requirements from our clients went up, which do not necessarily come with price tag, but obviously do come with cost. So I think that's a challenge. On the revenue side, fees have come down, and we have been in a very low interest rate environment, which obviously also has an impact on our revenues. And I think last but not least, the regulatory change, which is part of almost our BAU for everyone, but comes with a significant cost, right? So it's not just getting ready for regulation, but once that's implemented, there is a cost for the organization to comply with regulation.
So would you say that the mood in the industry is not incredibly upbeat or optimistic? It's, you know.
I wouldn't say that, I think, but it is probably depending where you are in the value chain. There is definitely a cost pressure, but obviously, and I think we're going to talk about that later, there is change happening. But I also think there's change needed to improve, especially the cost part, the efficiency part, which is not just a sub-custodian topic. Obviously, it will be the full chain.
And Jesus, I mean, as an organization, SIX looks both ways to some extent. So first of all, are you feeling the same sorts of pressures in a domestic context? And then, obviously, you talk to your colleagues at SIX who are looking at other markets. Are there any similarities?
Yeah, well, definitely I would say that in SIX Group we have 2 different roles. As you said, first of all, we are a CSD. We are both in Spain and Switzerland. And from the domestic perspective, 5 years ago, actually, we had the last wave of migrating to T2S. And the CSDR was implemented in 2014. And actually, both the technical T2S, the technical platform T2S, and the regulation open up the CSDs to competition. And therefore, we are competing its CSDs in T2S with the others. So definitely, for the last 5, 6, 7 years from the CSDs, I don't think there have been significant changes into the fees. We have maintained these. Even today, nowadays, in which in some of our countries the inflation rates are close to 10%, we will maintain the fees because we believe the cost pressure and our clients are demanding to really the contrary, to reduce fees as much as possible. From the other side, from the international custody business from the SIS, definitely the problems, the challenges, the changes that we are anticipating for the future is similar to what Stephen mentioned before.
So as a former global custodian, Kelly, before we come on to your present role,
Sure.
to what extent do you think the clients of the agent banks are responsible for the situation that Stephen described, particularly the squeezed margins? Is it just inevitable that what they're feeling they pass on down to their providers?
Yeah, I think for, just for all the years that I was on that side of the table, I'm not sure if I would describe it as pressure, but the reality is that as underlying beneficial owners, institutional investors, asset managers, their underlying clients, I think they are the major source of influence. I mean, certainly for all of the global custodians I was ever associated with or work with, there's always a somewhat maniacal focus on wanting to operate efficiently, cost effectively, in full compliance with regulation and controls and the like. But a lot of the initiatives that I think are causing operating change, we could talk a little bit more about what this means now in the digital era, but a lot of the impetus for operational change and efficiency is generally coming because there is a product or a service opportunity emerging with a client. So to answer your question more specifically, I think more often than not, it is the chance for a new revenue source, a new product, a new service, or the closure of some risk and control that is coming from the client side, an investor, an asset manager, asset or liability organization, and pushing that opportunity onto a global custodian or a sub-custodian, who are then translating it into the operating change that's ultimately needed. So it's a bit more of a domino effect rather than a direct catalyst. But picture the dominoes moving that's causing the discussions to happen.
So from your present role outside of global custody,
Sure.
does the industry look any different from how it looked when you were?
Yeah, in many ways, I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I was thinking about how to phrase what I think, which is it's a bit of a balance of I think some industry dynamics that are both very familiar, but then if what's very familiar is a constant state of change, then by definition, it's also something that is dynamic and changing in and of itself. I think the difference now, and we can talk a bit more about this, is a couple of things. One, the advent and the introduction of assets and workflows that are digital, right? So we park that there and come back to that a bit more. But certainly the introduction, not just simply of new asset types, but asset types that have different data models, different workflow structures, and change the way that assets move through a life cycle is a big topic of discussion. In fact, if you or just look at the agenda for the conference that we're all at right now, you can see that some form of digital or tokenization or blockchain or DLT or smart contracts, it's weaving its way into fully half of the dialogue. The other thing, though, is that you asked the question about is it coming from the investor side? I think the difference now is we're beginning to see the influence more from retail investors than perhaps ever before. Now, retail investors are the underlying beneficial owner of everything that we're actually talking about. But the ability for those retail investors to more directly influence their asset managers and their brokers that then onwardly influence the security services chain is, I think, more impactful and more noticeable than I've probably ever seen in my years of career, maybe bar when online brokering started.
Jesus, does that sound familiar to you? I don't think of SIX as having a great engagement with the retail end of the business. Am I wrong? Or, I mean, do you feel that influence?
I definitely see a lot of influence from the retail investors because actually, as long as the Spanish stock exchange is concerned, the retail investors traditionally have been very important in our Spanish stock exchange, and definitely we see that this is something that the retail investors are much more concerned about the management of the companies, the ESG issues, the voting of the company, the proxy voting services that we are offering. So actually, within SIX, for instance, mentioned the proxy voting services. This is something that we take very carefully, and we think it is important for the future, the retail investors to be involved in the management of the companies. It's important.
And Stephen, as an intermediary with an intermediary client, do the retail investors set the tone for expectations, or do you have any direct?
We are literally in between, right? So they would come in, whether that's a retailer, a corporate, our client would be, we would just be in between the GC or whatever, the asset manager and the CSD. Yeah, we don't feel that now, but there's definitely, retail is going to be more important, but it doesn't have an impact on us directly.
Now, of course, and Kay mentioned this, and digital assets, we're going to separate for the purposes of discussion the assets and the workflow, and we'll come back to the workflow in a while. How much pressure, this probably also comes from retail to some extent, or originates there, how much pressure are you under to skill up on digital asset processing? I mean, we've noticed at Global Custodian, for example, that in the beginning, the concept of digital custody was something that was filled by non-banks. It was non-banks that were making the news. Now we're seeing more of an offering coming from certainly some of the global custodians. Where do you sit with digital assets?
So we've definitely seen obviously a lot of inquiries, and we had discussions with clients, regulators, but DB is convinced that the innovations through distributed ledger technology will actually have a massive impact on the financial services industry. So, and we want to be part of that.
So we'll come back to, so that's really the process.
It's the
workflow. It's that you think is going to have the.
We'll have to adjust, and we will play a role there. Yeah.
And Jesus, you've got within SIX, you've got a separate organisation that's
Indeed
addressed this, and possibly was one of the early ones to go public. So since you started, has anything changed in that?
And now we have SDX, which is the trading platform, a CSD platform, totally approved by the FINMA, by the Swiss supervisor, and I think this is part of the future. It's coming, it's going to be slowly, but I'm sure this is definitely the future.
Now, what kind of questions are you getting, Kelly, from the people you speak to about, is it process related, is it asset related? What are people most engaged with? What you know?
Can I say that the answer is yes?
You can.
Well, I know, and I sort of, I understand the perspective and how you want to approach it of thinking about the asset, thinking about the process. I think the challenge is that it's hard to separate, or maybe the opportunity is a better way to say it. It's hard to separate the two when you think about the digital industry. And it goes directly to your question of what we're getting asked. I think when you think about the introduction of technologies, to your point exactly, the introduction of technologies that can support the security services, or more broadly financial services space, where those technologies enable the creation of assets that are digital or tokenized versions of traditional assets. The difference with this is that it's not just simply an opportunity to redefine how that asset is expressed, or to create a new asset using a digital structure. But the asset definition itself, the creation, the issuance of that new type of asset, the difference is that it now includes also the asset servicing, the life cycle event of that asset. It can also include some of the functionality like eligibility and allocation for some of the value-added services like clearing, collateral management and securities lending. So you have to think of the asset itself as now having a much more expansive, much more comprehensive way of defining it digitally. And so what we see as a series of questions are organizations focused on where do they start? Do they start by transforming some of the processes that support assets and support security services and payments, but want to introduce a digital element to it? Or do they start with asset issuance and then define the life cycle event on it. The truth of the matter is it really depends, and it goes back to your first question, where is the demand being driven from? If it comes in the form of something that is an asset type that investors and clients want to be supported, then it can go in one direction. If it's coming in the form of operating efficiency goals, it could come in the other. But the key about this technology is that it allows you to think about a comprehensive platform change, not just simply for asset types, but how those assets are then supported over the life cycle. And that tends to be the center of the questions we spend most of our time discussing, like at this conference and with others.
I guess I take on board what you said about this distinction that I'm still making.
That's all right. You're allowed to make it. You're in charge.
My problem, I guess, is that if you talk about digital assets, there are some that you see today, you know, in the common experience, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and then there's this idea of tokenizing existing assets, which is a different, in my mind, it's a slightly different ball game, and I don't see that. Is that actually happening?
Yeah, I think we see a blend of both, right? There's both the opportunity to create new assets that previously would have been impossible or impractical to think about in any other form other than digital, either because of the complexity or the expression of value that can only be achieved from a digital perspective. But I think the practical reality is, and this is, we've seen this in our industry before. We've lived through physical moving to dematerialized, and so we've seen these types of changes where assets get expressed in different ways. The reality is that it's always an evolution, right? It's never a big bang moment where an industry in totality is cutting over. So it's always an evolution, which means the tokenization, I think, to us is just the opportunity to embrace some of the benefits of being able to define multi-party workflows in a digital format, to be able to use some of these technologies, but to acknowledge that there are traditional assets as well as new digital assets emerging. And for a client or for a provider, you have to be able to manage both from a security services perspective.
Any?
No, I fully agree. I think it's an evolution. You said it's always an evolution, and I really believe. And the example of moving from the physical securities to the book entry securities took a long of time. And in many countries, still with some physical securities. So actually, what I see is definitely that. I would say that the DLT is the tool. It's not the objective from my perspective. I think that's very important.
That's right.
Because sometimes it seems that people believe this is going to be the objective. No, it's just a tool to improve what we already have. And I think there are many things on the current ecosystem that are good, and probably with DLT, I'm pretty sure about this, is going to be improved. But the way we are going to do it is probably with a blend of the new assets and moving slowly but constantly from the legacy system that we have today. And I believe they are going to be for quite a long time there. Cash equities, for instance, I think it's going to be complicated to move in an environment in which we have CCP netting, counterparty risk taken on board by the CCPs. To an atomic settlement of the DLT in the cash equities at least. No? So I think this is going to take a time. It is, of course, the future. It's going to happen. It's going to starting to happen, but slowly and absolutely we think that the regulation and central bank money is extremely important to move to that new landscape in the future.
And it doesn't really matter whether it's a tokenized security, traditional security, or digital asset, whether you believe in that or not. If you say have the role of the custodian, right? Because safekeeping those private keys and managing them just makes us super relevant on everything what happens around that asset on the blockchain.
So how much pressure are you coming under from your existing clients to have the ability, for example, to custody the private keys?
I wouldn't say it's pressure from the clients.
Okay.
It's us wanting to build this capability, and we actually will. I think we will be ready by the end of next year, and then we can offer at least the custodian part of that
And because, you know, history does always repeat itself, right? We've both been around long enough to know this. And so we've just cited now how we've gone through this as an industry before and moving from physical to dematerialized in most countries around the world. But to your point exactly, we've also seen this in terms of a new form or a new type of investment pulling the industry in a direction. And that's when global investing became a thing in the late 70s and early 80s, right? So it has a tendency to be driven by that which is creating the demand for assets to be created, traded, and held. And I think if you look to what is happening on that side, the creation, the demand around assets, how they're being traded and held, you're beginning to see the pattern on where ultimately the security services for those will move. Only because we have seen this before, right? It's just that this time is different because it's a reshaping of the definition of the asset in a way we haven't previously seen before.
Does it change the way that you each think about your clients or the people who you are clients of? Is the chain looking different? Is it breaking down to some extent? Stephen, for example, to what extent are global custodians still the focus of your attention as a sub-custodian?
Yeah.
Or,
So you mean compared to the potential the digital way? I think they are two different streams, and to go back to the global custodians, obviously they are extremely relevant because of their size. And it's not just a revenue topic. I think having a global custodian as part of your client portfolio, I mean, they set the bar high when it comes to their requirements and their innovation and their change, right? So that will make us better much quicker than if we would not have them as part of the portfolio. I think that's the real incentive to be part of that portfolio. But the digital one would be a separate stream, and we're not thinking about replacing GC business with the new world. I think that's too early. Also to see that as two different ones. We will have to build this custody capability first, and then, I mean, the interesting thing is how fungible will the assets be ultimately when it comes to trading.
Yeah.
There might be compete at the beginning. So no, I'm not worried about, we're not thinking about what's happening to our current client portfolio. They will still be there, and they will or may not transition into the new world. Or we might have two different streams.
Jesus, are you still thinking like Stephen about?
Well, actually, we are a financial market infrastructure, and in our NDA, we have that our clients are the financial institutions, mainly banks, and therefore even with the new technology, we are not thinking in changing the clients that we have. We will maintain our clients. We try to maintain them, the financial institutions, the banks, and we are not aiming at all to try to reach the retail investors. It's the business of the custodians and the banks in the end, and we are trying to serve as much as possible the necessities and the requirements from our clients, which are the banks, not the final investors.
So I would also expect the same clients to transition, so they will remain our clients, right?
Yeah,
So it's more a question of how close do we work with them to get to the new world, rather than think about potential new client types.
You know, I get asked all the time whether or not, you know, coming from my background and now being in the digital space, do we see any of these roles? This is a slight variation of your question, but do we see any of these roles getting disintermediated? And my answer is always no, because the reality is that sub-custodians are being used at its core. Sub-custodians have a degree of local market expertise that is not available anywhere else, right? There just is a level of expertise that comes by being present in the market, knowing the political and economic landscape, and being able to use that to make decisions on behalf of entities that hold assets in those countries. From a global custody perspective, whether the whole world shifts to holding assets digitally or not, there is still often a fiduciary responsibility that underlying beneficial owners are asking custodians to do. So it's not like the creation of digital assets is going to make pension plan holders say, oh, good news, now I can hold all my assets directly myself. They're still going to look to the custodian infrastructure from global to local around the globe to have those assets held in sound and prudent man rule ways or prudent person rule ways, and to be able to have them serviced expertly in the market. I think the difference is, though, is what has happened is with the introduction of these technologies, a couple of things. One is that you can now begin to have an unbroken chain of control over the asset. So whereas if I'm a global custodian and I'm hiring a sub-custodian for those local market purposes, I actually have to transfer the control of that asset to you in order for you to be able to perform that function. In a more smart contract driven model, I can still maintain control. I can digitally enable you to have the authority, the delegated authority to act on my behalf in that market. I think post-2008, where global custodians started to take on the not just simply due diligence responsibility of picking sub-custodians, but also sometimes the solvency, or more often than not the solvency, and the balance sheet implications of that, that begins to get wiped away now. So if I, as a global custodian, am going to hold control of the asset, but still use the sub-custodians around the globe, but I'm still controlling the asset, then I no longer should have to finance the decision I made and the solvency of that sub-custodian because they don't have control of the asset to begin with. So I think it's those types of shifts, Richard, that get at the core of your question. It's not that the roles will be different or how we interact, but the process that supports us and how assets are controlled throughout the chain, which, as you said at the beginning, we'll talk about whether there's a chain, but the process of controlling the chain, that changes, and I think it begins to more right-align the risk and responsibilities in a way that got a little out of whack necessarily so, but a little out of whack post-2008.
So do you see the challenges? I mean, you obviously speak to the types of organizations we've already outlined, whether it's the institutional investor, the asset manager, the global custodian, the sub-custodian, and the market infrastructure. Are they, and Jesus mentioned being a CSD, are the challenges, are they all facing the same challenges with regard to changing assets and changing workflows, or is it more difficult for some of those organizations than others to get to grips with what they're facing, or to take advantage of the opportunity?
Yeah, I said, and just to give an initial thought, I said, I get asked this question all the time, nobody's going to get disintermediated. What I didn't say, though, is it does open the door for new entrants to, well, not new entrants, but for the services that we would think across a security services chain to become more portable and be able to be offered by different organizations. Goldman Sachs is creating a tokenization network. Well, you would have thought that that would actually be a function of a CSD, but Goldman Sachs, as a major market participant, can now create that. So I think it begins to make some of the roles more portable or composable in ways that don't currently exist. And I think that's why when you take a look at some of the major market initiatives that are underway across this space, both organizations here representing really good examples of doing that and doing it early. But you see market participants, you see banks, you see broker-dealers, you see CSDs, all systemically important financial entities, but very different types of entities that all now have access to being able to redefine the workflows using these types of technologies.
So in practical terms, I mean, Stephen, are you seeing the competitive landscape changing? Are there people that you're now competing with who you wouldn't have considered in your space before?
This with regard to the digital asset topic, or in general?
Well, in general, but including the digital asset topic, or is it still looking, is it the same people coming to the table?
I think it's still the same. Still the same player. Obviously, if you look into the fintech space, it's a different sector, differently regulated, or not regulated. But no, I would kind of say it's probably the same players, the same chain, discussing the same topics and working on the same topic.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, what I see is definitely not changing the type of the participants in our industry, but definitely this part of evolution is going to be changes in the participants. So more competition, consolidation. Some of them, I think, maybe they are not going to be ready for the digital evolution that we are talking about too. Therefore, but the types of the participants that we have, from the financial market infrastructure to the custodian, global, local, I still see that there's going to be in the future the role of these functions are still going to be in the ecosystem, because actually the industry, our industry has demonstrated in this century that we are resilient, that we have a good performance in stress scenarios, in crisis moments in the century. So actually, why we are going to completely have a revolution? No, I think it's just a question of evolution, and I think regulators actually do not believe they are going to have a revolution in something that today is already working. Could work better, could have this DLT of digital assets evolution improving everything, that's true, but not necessarily to have a complete new ecosystem or new industry from scratch. I don't see that.
It will still be interesting to see in the future how the new ecosystem communicates and interacts with the old. Because you don't want to end up with two, because you're going to split the liquidity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There will be custody too.
Yeah.
So the ultimate goal should be to have not necessarily one, but the two
Absolutely.
being super efficient, communicating with each other.
Actually, you allow me, I mean, some of the clients that we already have from SIS, from SDX, they have requested us to construct a bridge between SDX and SECOM, the SIS legacy system. So actually, securities could be native digital, and they can move to the book entry system, or the other way around. So actually, this evolution is going to be, as you said, also that it's going to be the blended of the two worlds for the future, I think.
This is
You go
I just want to say this is within one organization, but I'm also talking about the international landscape. Right?
Oh, yeah.
If you
That's
have
also
half of the world being in the developed world, still being in the old world, you will still have two worlds to
which would ultimately be
serve.
inefficient itself.
It will be inefficient, so that should be handled.
To
as
speed
well.
in this evolution, no? The world is moving to 2 or 3 or more speeds in this evolution. But I think it also happened with the dematerialization of the securities. I mean, there are going to be parts of the ecosystem and the industry much more evolutionated than the others.
But I think what I hear when you are both speaking is different from the past, which is sort of a creation of a new system or a new process. What's implied in what you're both saying is that what's changing here is, I don't mean to get deeply technical, but that what's changing here is the data model, how data is defined, how it's composed together to create services or products or assets or workflows. It's not to your point, it's not the creation of another system sitting over here, which is then yet another silo to be reconciled with every other silo that exists in the industry. What's implied in what you're both saying is that there's the creation of this new interconnected way of working together, where it's data itself that is being redefined differently, and that may deploy on some of the traditional systems that exist to support non-digital assets right now, or it may deploy on systems that are created brand new just to be able to support entirely new digital and tokenized assets. But it is, and that I think that's what's different. It's not some new service or some new process. It's a way of thinking about data differently, so that I'm not just thinking about it uniquely and solely for myself, and that you all are doing it uniquely solely for yourselves, and we're going to use a really good reconciliation process between us. Instead, now we're saying we're going to create a shared one between us. And I'll access it, and I'll permission what you're entitled to see, and you'll access it and permission what I'm entitled to see. But that is a shared now mutual data flow. And that I think is what's driving a lot of the change here. It's not like any transformation we've ever gone through before, but there are some really good lessons learned from history as to how to make it not be an inefficient result, which is what you're quite rightly pointing out.
So I'm going to take a step back now, because we've been speculating to some extent about what's coming, and we've referenced some of the milestone moments that caused change, 2008. We haven't mentioned the pandemic, which is good because we've been going for half an
We're all
hour
trying to
without
forget it.
mentioning COVID, which is,
We're all celebrating
Yeah.
the fact that we're here in person.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
But is there anything that's happened, say, over the past half decade or so in the industry that has taken you to some extent by surprise? So where things, if you look back now, things didn't go the way you were expecting them to go. Not necessarily with catastrophic or amazing consequences for you, but just generally. And it's a difficult question because I'm asking you
To say something
say you were
negative.
fallible. but let's start with Jesus.
No, I mean, not big surprise. We moved to T2S 5 years ago. We have implemented CSDR without the exception, with the exception of the settlement discipline regime. It was in place in force on 2014, the CSDR. Settlement discipline regime, 1st of February. So there are many changes in the last 5 years, not a surprise, because any change of this, of course, needed a preparation for a long time. We have also, in July, we have seen that there is a new service announced by the European Central Bank, the National Central Bank of Belgium and the European Commission. It is going to be called from the European Central Bank the EU Issuance Service. This is a new service that they are going to offer to the market based on the, especially driven by the next generation bonds from the European Commission. And it's something that for many years the European Central Bank, they were talking to the industry, to the market, whether the market wanted to have a public sector influence on the issuance side or not. And then suddenly they have decided to go on this road, no, I think. Not entirely a surprise because we were part of the conversations in the past, but we didn't think that it was going to be presented during this summer.
And Steven?
Yeah, so I haven't been in this business for 10 years, so I can't reflect that far back. Actually, I do think that the pandemic and even, let's say, the sanctions we have seen was handled in a good way. Right? There would not have been a surprise. So I'm not necessarily caught by surprise in the past, but I am surprised about joining this business not too long ago, that there is, I still think there's a lack of harmonization when it comes to data or APIs or market standards, settlement cycles. And obviously that can happen because we have many participants in the value chain, but I would have expected the bigger part of the chain to want to be super efficient. Coming back to the beginning of the discussion, because everybody has these cost pressures. So just based on the cost pressures, I would have expected all of us to come to more efficient security services landscape. So that is, I'm surprised. I'm not caught by surprise, but I'm surprised when I looked into that.
And what's stopping that?
That's a very good question. Yeah. So, yeah, what that would mean, I will have to start blaming, and so so probably a couple of things, and this is not blaming, but obviously there are some strong players in the chain who might have not necessarily the incentive to change now. Then probably markets move to T+1 and having T+2 in another market. Obviously that is an issue, but a T+1 move probably doesn't care too much about what's happening in the rest of the world. So that might be, that's not the value chain, that's the local markets moving. But it's a very good question. It's probably us not sharing data enough, not having worked on sharing that data, and it made the processing extremely complex and expensive for relatively simple to explain product. Right? It's just settlement and post-trade services. So it's very difficult why this commodity is priced as a commodity, but the cost to get there is relatively high.
Kelly, would you say that it's local considerations that prevent, up to now at any rate, a more coordinated approach to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think well, I think a couple of things. I'd like to go back to what surprises me. But in terms of that, I think for some of these opportunities with technology that have been emerging, say, over the last 6 or 7 years, there was a period of time of education, even evangelism, to learn about them a little bit. But somehow in that process, the dialogue got a bit backwards and sort of leading with let's talk about the infrastructure first before we talk about what the business and the use case is. And I think that was really just born out of a desire to learn it and to understand it. Not really local, but say smaller in the sense of just trying to understand the technology. I think what we see now is that that's flipped itself back right size, and indeed that's how you both have described it, but flipped it back where you're leading with the creation of a new revenue stream, the reduction of a risk, the opportunity to expand a service, and the technology, to your point exactly, is something that is not driving it, is the consequence of it. And so I think it's been about going in that cycle of thought, and why we see it coming now into the forefront so differently. But if I could, I just want to, yeah, only because I'd like to. Yeah, no, I thought about this because we chatted about it a little bit in the preparation, and candidly, what I want to say is, I lived through the 1987 crash, in addition to the 2008, and sort of every variation of bubbles in between, and 9/11. And to some degree, I really thought I had seen it all by the time 2008 had come around, because in 1987 it was all about program trading and the creation of limits and controls in the exchanges and the stocks, the security systems around the world, so that the pre-trading and trading behavior could be controlled a bit better in the marketplace. And then you get to 2008, and it was about credit and liquidity and the ability of organizations who are operating in those markets to be able to sustain themselves if liquidity is not as available as it was yesterday. So I really thought I had seen it all. What surprised me was and as a consequence of that, most organizations in the market have to prove regularly to regulators that they can handle stress levels on their platforms. When I was previously at JP Morgan, we had to do it all the time, right? So you had to be able to prove you could handle stress levels. So I was really incredibly surprised at the degree to which the market volatility, and think back to sort of March or April of 2020, and some of the new highs that were achieved in many markets around the world, how destabilizing that was. I would have thought that in all of the market conditions of extremes that we had seen, we would have been prepared for anything. And I was surprised at the degree to which some of the stress levels being reached in the markets required the entire system to be shut down for batch processing over a weekend, or halting of trading so that the batch systems could catch up. So I think it kind of took the lens off, or took the cover off a little bit of the little secret that maybe post-trade had not yet caught up to the amount of efficiency and operating scalability that pre-trade had. And I think that's why we see conferences like this now so focused on the post-trade space, because we got, in the last 2 years, a pretty serious wake-up call that maybe post-trade isn't as scalable and secure and exponentially growable as we would have thought it would be post-2008. And that surprised me. Not surprisingly, some of the conversations we're now having are, yes, of course, about functionality, and yes, of course, about privacy and security, but the amount of time we spend on performance and scalability is, I think, a direct result of what got experienced during the pandemic.
Jesus, how did it look from this volatility from market infrastructure?
I would give a more optimistic view, at least from this perspective, because I think there are two things here. I think one is the harmonization. Definitely, in terms of harmonization, there are many things still to be done, but we have done a lot. I mean, during the last years. I mean, actually, this industry 10 years ago 20 years ago, we were always discussing about the geobanking barriers and the differences we have. But on the other side, sorry, they have been a driver for the harmonization, and I think we are harmonizing a lot. I'm coming from a country, a peculiar Spain, in which the system 7 years ago were completely different, very specificity, a lot of specificities in our system, and now we are year after year harmonizing. We are very close to fully harmonized with all the standards in Europe. So actually, it's taking a lot of time. And now I think the most differences that we have in the market probably are stemming from the public sector, the fiscal differences that we have between the countries, and that's very complicated because the European Commission, they do not have here competencies. The member states, they already have it, so actually it's complicated. No? That's from the harmonization part. From the reliability and scalability that you mentioned, I have to be optimistic because actually, I mean, there is always a limit, and you never know what the limit is. But to be honest with you, in April 2020, the volumes that we faced, just starting the pandemic, in Spain, for instance, that March was a complete disaster in terms of the people who was infected. We were suddenly, from one day to another, all the workers, we were from the premises to home. Some of our colleagues were ill, actually, were not available to work. So actually, at that time, we thought there was going to be a big problem, but in reality, we passed. I have to recognize that we all made a big effort in all the industry, not only, of course, in the CSDs, but also in the custodians. And we faced with the volumes that we had to face from a situation that we were not expecting just 1 month before this crisis happened. So actually, it's optimistic. So actually, of course, there are limits. You never know what the limit is. We have to always try to test, and we are forced, the CSDs, every year to test this because of the CSDR. But obviously, there is part of the evolution for the future with the new technologies to scale up our systems for the future.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you pointed to the resilience of the infrastructures and that was proved, I think, in 2008. And you've also mentioned the regulators and the impact of certain regulations. Cynically, none of you, but we, as journalists, often say that regulators are always regulating for the last crisis. Are regulators and regulation, are they a catalyst to the changes that the industry needs to see, or are they a brake on the changes that the industry needs to see? And if you don't want to answer the question, by all means, don't answer it, but I'd like to throw it out there.
May I?
You may.
Well, maybe because I started working for the Banco de España for 12 years, I have to recognize that it is sort of a popular sentence to say that the regulators are always stopping the innovation. And I think we have to be fair. I mean, the role is not easy. I mean, the changes that the industry and the financial is seeing on the last years is difficult to be always on the forefront of the demonstration of the changes. On the other hand, I think the regulators, by definition, they should be conservative. They cannot actually enter into new ecosystems without not proving that this is going to be a good way to be followed. So to some extent, what they're doing is, I think, they're trying to do their best in order not to stop the innovation in which we are with the pilot regime is an example. MiCA has just been released. So maybe this could be improved. I'm sure everything can be improved. But from my perspective, they're trying to do their best, and they are aware that they cannot stop or have these breaks on the initiatives that we have to follow in Europe, at least. It's difficult for them.
Any comment on that?
Yeah, I think, listen, I have a very healthy respect for regulation, having been in the roles that I've been before, and I do mean that sincerely. I think a couple of things. I think sort of many facet things. I'll leave to you, Richard, to try and figure out some sense out of what I'm about to say. But I think on one hand, particularly with regard to securities regulation, I think it's critically important that the regulators are as engaged as they are, potentially putting some brakes or maybe walking more slowly to the digital and the crypto era. Less so because of the assets themselves or the organizations that are bringing them to market, but candidly, because we have seen this before, where retail and individual investors get into a marketplace, some guardrails and some guidelines with regard to clear and fair information, not overly marketing or suggesting a performance outcome that may not be achievable. I mean, I'm not really sure that everybody who read Wall Street Bets on the GameStop and AMC were really sophisticated individual investors who could understand and really begin to filter for them personally against their goals what they were reading. And so I do always think that in the age where more and more information is available at the fingertips of people who might not be investment professionals, it's good to have guardrails. I'm not suggesting that the regulators should step in and limit the ability of individuals to be able to do, but I think particularly in the security space, it's good to have guardrails and it's good to think about the consequences, because the knock-on effect in the digital era is not only could you lose everything, you could lose it way the heck faster than you ever did before. And so it's really, I think, important to have good structure and good controls and good communication requirements and the like. What I do see on the flip side, though, and I know it's a little bit off focus for this, so I won't go too deeply, but where we do see, I think, a healthy amount of regulatory innovation and direction is in digital currency, necessarily so, since ultimately it would be driven by them in a full and complete way. So for us, it's been a bit of a balance where we can see both a desire to create, as I said, regulatory guardrails or to understand, and at the same time be pushing innovation into how some of these digital workflows and expression of digital assets can compel economies forward, not even industries, but economies. I think the one thing that's been different for me from all of my past experiences is for the first time we do actually see the regulators not only stepping in to understand the process and regulate, but to really understand the technology. And for the very first time, sort of get their hands into it themselves and know that if you're going to regulate industries that are compelled forward by technology, you probably need to understand that technology firsthand.
So, yeah, sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, just 2 comments on regulation. So I think the first one is it tends to affect the full chain, which is good in a sense, so that the cost will not, and the work is not sticking to one, either the provider or the client. So I do think that these are multi-year projects, then being postponed and postponed again. So I would wish that we would be more targeting to the ultimate target date, right, and just get it done. But because you were, sorry, I forgot the question, but you're saying what's the choice? Sorry, you said does the regulation actually force us to change?
Yeah, does it
and
move things forward or does
right?
it hold things back?
Yeah, so take the CSDR regulation where it's implemented. The settlement fields are not really improving. So we will have to have a second look. And it's not just to comply with the regulation, but this will actually lead to us looking into how we communicate all the way back through the chain. So that's actually helping us to do something, which, and that was what I wanted to say earlier, or what I did say earlier, which I would have expected the market to do anyway. So this is probably helping to get to more efficient.
Okay, so just before we draw to a close, I want to come back to this. I promised that we would separate process and assets in the digital space. But I want to go back to my very first question. We assumed that there is an investment chain or a transaction chain, as there traditionally has been, and you're all intermediaries at somewhere on this chain. We've heard that from Kelly that she thinks no one's going to be disintermediated in the digital world. There are fiduciary responsibilities that people will still have to do, but what changes are the technologies that we've been skirting around going to make to the workflow that currently exists if you look forward?
Yeah, from my perspective, it's a great question. From my perspective, what we're seeing, the number one thing that's different, I mean, there are many, many things that are different, but the current and most compelling topic we're talking about now with organizations is when they're creating these new solutions, whether they're tokenized assets or a set of digitally expressed workflows and services, the focus is not just simply on changing that operating model within the confines of their own organization, but they're focused on creating these economic networks across, not across borders from a country, but across borders from organizations. In other words, how can I take what I previously would have thought as straight through processing goals that begin and end at the edges of my system in my own organization? And now we're challenged to work with clients to define what are those workflows and those edges if I want to define a process that now goes into my client or even into the counterpart or maybe even into a competitor. How do I get this expression not just simply of products and services, but how they actually deploy on a network where I can begin to interoperate with other solutions that are in this same space, still preserve my privacy rules or just even the rules of who can use my product or service, still have the security that I demand by being a financial services organization. But how can I go beyond the boundaries of my own systems and define workflows and solutions that are shared or mutualized with my clients or competitors or counterparties? And that is a very different way of thinking, but it has a presence of thought in every initiative we're working on right now.
And it actually solves a lot of the issues we have now, right? Yes.
No, definitely. I think Kelly mentioned many times during today that the processes is key to improve the processes, and I think both the digital assets and the smart contracts together, they have the ability to change completely, and not only because they are going to be new digital assets, but much more importantly from the processes perspective, there are going to be improvements with the smart contracts related to areas or domains that today we need a lot of resources, and there are a lot of mistakes, such as the reconciliation and of course the corporate events, the asset servicing. All of this is going to be very much improved with these new technologies, I believe.
And I think that is a good optimistic note on which to wrap this up. So we've been around, we've done a tour of the industry during this discussion, but I think at the end of it, we're all feeling reasonably good, despite the challenges that are coming. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Our
you.
pleasure.
Thank you.